Welcome to the Well-Being Podcast, where every episode is a step toward a healthier, happier you. Let's grow, thrive, and shine together. Don't forget to subscribe and like the Well-Being Podcast. Share your thoughts, and let us know in the comments what topics you'd love to hear about in future episodes. Today we're taking a deep dive into something we all experience but might not fully understand.
Anger.
Exactly, anger. We'll uncover what it is, where it comes from, and how to navigate it effectively.
You know, it's fascinating how anger is often portrayed as this negative, destructive force.
Yeah.
But it's actually a primal emotion, deeply rooted in our survival instincts. Think of our ancestors facing down a saber-toothed tiger.
Oh, wow.
Anger provided that burst of energy and focus needed to fight or flee.
Okay, so anger has an evolutionary purpose. It's not inherently bad, but how do we reconcile that with the fact that anger can lead to some pretty damaging behaviors?
That's where things get interesting. You see, while that initial surge of anger might be hardwired, what we do with that anger, our reactions and behaviors, those are learned. It's like we inherit a set of tools for expressing anger. But those tools might be rusty, outdated, or even downright dangerous.
Yes, so it's not about erasing anger altogether, but rather learning to use the right tools, the right techniques to express it in a healthy way.
Exactly. Think of it like learning to manage fire.
Okay.
Fire can be destructive, but it can also provide warmth, cook our food, even forge new creations.
Wow.
It all depends on how we handle it.
That's a great analogy.
Right.
So where do we begin? How do we start upgrading our anger toolkit?
The first step is self-awareness. Understanding your own personal anger landscape. What are your triggers? What are the subtle signs that your anger is starting to rise? Maybe your heart races, your jaw clenches, or you start having those negative thoughts spiraling in your head.
It's like having an internal anger alarm system.
Right.
But one we often hit the snooze button on.
Right.
We ignore those early warning signs until, bam, we're at a 10, totally overwhelmed by anger.
Exactly. And that's where a tool like the anger meter can be incredibly helpful. It's simply a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is totally calm and 10 is full-blown rage.
Okay.
By checking in with yourself throughout the day and rating your anger level, you start to notice those subtle shifts before they escalate.
Okay, so we're becoming more aware of our anger levels.
Yeah.
But what's the next step? How do we actually start changing those unhelpful reactions?
This is where we move from awareness to action. One powerful technique is something called the anger awareness record.
What?
It's like a journal where you track the situations that trigger your anger, the specific cues you experience, how high your anger spikes on that 1 to 10 scale, and then most importantly, the consequences, both good and bad, of your reaction.
It's like becoming a detective of your own anger.
Right.
You're gathering evidence to understand those patterns, to see what's really fueling the fire.
Precisely. And once you start to see those patterns emerge,
Yeah.
you can develop a personalized anger control plan, a set of strategies tailored to your unique triggers and reactions.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Absolutely not. Just like we all have different personalities and experiences, our approaches to anger management will be unique. What works for one person might not work for another.
That makes sense. So let's dive into some of those strategies. What are some of the tools we can add to our anger management toolbox?
Well, one of the most effective techniques is the timeout.
Okay.
And it's exactly what it sounds like. When you feel that anger rising, you hit the pause button, step away from the situation, and give yourself time to cool down.
So simple, yet so powerful. But I imagine it's not always easy to just walk away in the heat of the moment.
Yeah.
Are there other strategies we can use when we're feeling trapped or overwhelmed by anger?
Absolutely. Relaxation techniques are incredibly powerful. Deep breathing, for example, can help calm your physiology and slow down that racing heartbeat.
I've heard that taking a few slow, deep breaths can actually trick your nervous system into thinking you're calming down, even if you're still feeling angry. Is that right?
Exactly. It's like sending a message to your brain saying, okay, we're good. We can handle this.
That's amazing. What are some other relaxation techniques we can use in those moments of intense anger?
Well, there's progressive muscle relaxation, where you systematically tense and release different muscle groups. It's like giving yourself a mini massage from the inside out.
Oh, wow.
And it helps release physical tension, which often goes hand in hand with anger.
I can see how that would be helpful,
Yeah.
especially if you tend to clench your jaw or tighten your fists when you're angry. It's like giving your body a way to physically release that pent-up energy. What else can we do to tame those angry thoughts?
This is where we tap into the power of the mind with something called cognitive restructuring.
Okay.
It's about recognizing and challenging those negative thought patterns that often fuel our anger.
You mean those thoughts like, this is so unfair, or
Yeah.
they always do this to me?
Exactly. Those kinds of thoughts can create a vicious cycle amplifying our anger and making it harder to respond calmly and rationally.
So how do we break that cycle? How do we stop those angry thoughts from taking over?
There are a few techniques we can use. One is the ABCD model, where you break down the situation that triggered your anger, your beliefs about that situation, the consequences of those beliefs, and then you dispute those unhelpful beliefs.
So it's like taking those angry thoughts to court and presenting a counter-argument, a more balanced and realistic perspective.
Precisely. You're becoming your own defense attorney, advocating for a more rational and compassionate view of the situation.
That's such a cool way to think about it. It's like we have the power to reframe those anger-inducing thoughts and choose a different path, a more peaceful path.
You're getting it. And another powerful technique is something called thought stopping, where you literally tell yourself, stop, when those negative thoughts creep in. It's like putting up a mental stop sign to halt those destructive thought patterns in their tracks.
Wow, these are some incredible tools. I'm starting to feel like we're building quite an arsenal here. But I'm curious, where does all this anger come from in the first place?
That's a great question, and it's one we'll delve into more deeply in our next episode. Stay tuned.
Awesome. Can't wait.
You know, before we were talking about where all this anger comes from, and, it really is a complex question.
It is.
With, multifaceted answers, but one piece of the puzzle often lies in our families. Those first classrooms where we learn about emotions, relationships, and, yes, even anger.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
We learn by observing the people around us, especially our parents or caregivers. They're our role models, for better or worse.
Right.
But how exactly do those early family dynamics influence our anger?
It's like we inherit an emotional legacy, a set of beliefs and behaviors around anger that we often carry with us unconsciously.
Unconsciously.
Think about it. How was anger expressed in your family growing up? Was it explosive with shouting and door slamming, or was it suppressed with icy silence and passive aggression?
Wow, those are powerful questions. And I imagine the answers can be pretty eye-opening. They can help us understand why we might react to anger in certain ways, even if those reactions aren't serving us well.
You're right. For example, if you grew up in a household where anger was always met with punishment or disapproval, you might learn to suppress your anger.
Yeah.
Even when it's justified.
Yeah.
Or if you witnessed a lot of volatile anger, you might unconsciously adopt those same patterns in your own relationships.
It's like we're following a script that was written for us long ago without even realizing it. But the good news is we're not stuck with that script. We can rewrite it.
Exactly. And that rewriting process starts with awareness. It's about acknowledging those early influences, those inherited patterns, without judgment. It's about saying, okay, this is where some of my anger habits come from. Now, how can I choose a different path?
So it's not about blaming our parents or dwelling on the past, but rather understanding how those experiences shaped us so we can move forward with more self-compassion and conscious choices.
Precisely. And once you've started to uncover those early influences, you can begin to identify your own unique anger patterns.
Yeah.
How do you typically react when you're angry? Do you withdraw? Do you lash out? Do you try to please everyone and avoid conflict at all costs? The more you understand your patterns, the more power you have to change them.
It's like becoming an observer of your own anger. You're stepping back and watching yourself in action, noticing those habitual reactions without judgment.
Exactly. And as you become more aware of those patterns, you can start experimenting with different responses. If you tend to withdraw, maybe you challenge yourself to express your feelings in a calm and assertive way. If you tend to explode, maybe you practice taking a time out or using those relaxation techniques we talked about earlier.
It's like building new neural pathways, new habits of responding to anger in a healthier way. But I imagine that rewiring process can be challenging. It's not like we can just flip a switch and change overnight.
You're right. It takes time, practice, and a lot of self-compassion. And sometimes it's helpful to have some guidance along the way.
You mean like therapy?
Exactly. Therapy can provide a safe and supportive space to explore those deep-seated patterns, to understand where they came from, and to develop new coping mechanisms. And it's not just about individual therapy either. Family therapy can be incredibly powerful for healing those old wounds and creating healthier dynamics.
It's like hitting the reset button on those family scripts, rewriting them together to create a more peaceful and loving environment.
Exactly. It's about creating a space where anger can be acknowledged and expressed in a healthy way, where everyone feels heard and respected.
That sounds amazing. But what about anger that stems from sources outside of our families, like work stress or social injustices? How do we deal with those kinds of triggers?
Those are great questions, and ones we'll explore in depth right after this.
So we've been talking about how our families and past experiences can shape our reactions to anger. But what about those anger triggers that come from outside our personal bubbles? Things like work stress or current events, even, that frustratingly long line at the grocery store.
Oh, yeah.
How do we handle those without letting anger hijack our day?
It's true. Our modern world seems to be a breeding ground for anger triggers. The key is recognizing that we always have a choice in how we respond.
Hmm.
We can't control everything that happens to us,
Right.
but we can control how we react. It's like that old saying, you can't stop the birds from flying overhead, but you can stop them from building a nest in your hair.
Okay, I love that analogy.
Yeah.
So it's not about denying our anger or pretending those external triggers don't bother us, but rather choosing a different path, a more constructive way to channel that energy.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
about building resilience, that inner strength that helps us bounce back from challenges without letting anger take the wheel.
Okay.
And one of the most effective ways to build resilience is through stress management.
Stress management, that makes sense. The more we can reduce our overall stress levels, the less reactive we'll be to those everyday triggers. It's like having a buffer, a protective shield against anger.
Precisely. And there are so many ways to manage stress. Exercise, meditation, spending time in nature, listening to music, pursuing hobbies that bring you joy. It's about finding what works for you and making it a regular part of your routine.
It's like having an arsenal of relaxation tools at your disposal, ready to deploy when those anger triggers strike.
Hmm.
But what about those situations where stress is unavoidable, like a high-pressure work deadline or dealing with a difficult family member?
Even in those situations, there are tools we can use. One powerful technique is shifting our perspective. Instead of getting caught up in the emotionality of the situation, ask yourself, is this something I can control? If it is, great, take action, make a plan, and focus on what you can do to improve the situation.
And if it's not something you can control?
Then it's about letting go. It's about accepting that sometimes life is unfair, things don't always go our way,
Right.
and that's okay. It doesn't mean we have to like it, but we don't have to let it control our emotions.
Easier said than done, right?
Okay.
But I can see how that shift in perspective, focusing on what we can control and letting go of what we can't, could be incredibly freeing. It takes away that feeling of powerlessness that often fuels anger.
Absolutely. It's about choosing our battles wisely, conserving our energy for the things we can actually change. And sometimes that means walking away from a conflict, knowing when to disengage and preserve your own peace of mind.
That reminds me, we talked earlier about assertiveness training. How does that fit into managing anger, especially when it comes to conflicts with other people?
Assertiveness is a key skill in navigating anger effectively. It's about communicating your needs and boundaries clearly and respectfully without resorting to aggression or becoming passive.
Okay.
It's about finding that sweet spot between being a doormat and a bulldozer.
So it's about standing up for yourself,
Yeah.
but doing it in a way that doesn't escalate the conflict or damage the relationship.
Exactly. And remember, assertiveness is a skill, which means it takes practice. One helpful technique is role-playing. Practice expressing your feelings and setting boundaries with a trusted friend or family member, or even rehearse in front of a mirror. It might feel silly, but it can make a big difference when you're facing a real-life conflict.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like rehearsing for a play. So when you're on stage, you feel more confident and prepared.
Mhm.
What are some other tips for communicating assertively, especially when we're feeling angry?
One simple but powerful tip is to use I statements. Instead of blaming the other person with, you always do this, try saying, I feel frustrated when this happens. It takes the focus off of attacking the other person and puts it on expressing your own experience.
That's such a subtle shift in language,
Mhm.
but I can see how it would make a big difference in the tone of the conversation.
Yeah.
It keeps things more open and less confrontational.
Exactly. And sometimes the most assertive thing you can do is simply walk away from a heated conversation. Taking a time out, giving everyone a chance to cool down, can prevent things from escalating into a full-blown argument.
It's like hitting the pause button on a movie that's getting too intense. You can always come back to it later with a fresh perspective and a calmer mind. But before we wrap up, I'm curious, what's the one key takeaway you hope our listeners will remember from this deep dive into anger?
I'd say it's this. Anger is a natural human emotion, but it doesn't have to control your life. You have the power to choose how you respond, and there are effective strategies to help you manage anger in a healthy and constructive way. It's a journey, not a destination.
Beautifully said. It's about recognizing that anger is a part of us, but it doesn't define us. We can choose to be the master of our anger, not the other way around. And remember, you don't have to do this alone. Reach out to a therapist, a counselor, or a trusted friend or family member for support. There's no shame in seeking help, and it can make all the difference in your journey toward mastering your anger.
Absolutely.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive on anger management. Thanks so much for being here.
It was my pleasure.
And thanks all of you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and like the Wellbeing Podcast. We'll be back next week with another episode to help you grow, thrive, and shine. Until then, take care everywhere.
Stay inspired, and we'll see you next time.